Sometimes motivation starts with a simple question. Why does this matter? Welcome to Speaking of Higher Ed. I'm Andrew Everett, and this is episode 44. Today we're joined by Dr. Jesse Bishop, Director of the Center for Excellence in Teaching and Learning at Georgia Highlands College, to talk about student motivation, transparency in teaching, and the role of playful reflection in learning. We'll explore how approaches like transparency in learning and teaching, also known as TILT, and Lego Serious Play can help faculty make the purpose of learning more visible for students. Dr. Bishop, thank you for being with us.
Thanks for having me. This is fantastic.
We appreciate your time. And as we get started, could you share a little bit about your path in higher education and what led to the work you're doing today?
Sure. So when I graduated from high school, I was a first-gen college student, and now, obviously, first-gen college graduate. So my support structure wasn't great. Straight out of high school, I kind of panicked and decided not to go to school. The process just felt really overwhelming, navigating things, figuring out how to pay for things. My family solidly, blue-collar folks, and I spent about 3 years figuring out all the things I didn't want to do, or at least maybe most of the things I didn't want to do. So when I finally decided to go back to school, I started at GHC. It was actually called Floyd College then, a 2-year school, and worked through some core courses, figured out what I wanted to do with my life. I think still, I'm not 100% sure, but I decided to major in English. I wanted to be a college professor. I loved talking about literature. I loved writing, loved creative writing. So I got a bachelor's in English, a master's in English in poetry. Started teaching, landed sort of the unicorn job straight out, tenure track, all that good stuff. Decided to go back for a PhD and realized sitting in a traffic jam on the way to a PhD class one night that I didn't really care as much about Melville as I thought I did. What I really cared about was how we talked about Melville in a teaching and learning setting. And that really kind of stems from a professor I had that I'll talk about him in a minute. But I got really, really interested in the ways that we learn, in the psychology of learning, in the social aspects of learning and teaching. And so I dropped out of that program. I applied to the Governor's Teaching Fellows program, went through that and realized that I had actually found my path, and then went back and started a doctorate that was more teaching and learning focused and assessment, evaluation, that sort of thing. As soon as I finished that up, I founded the CEDL here at Georgia Highlands. We had some faculty development, but it was a little disjointed and not a sort of fully realized center and program. So I took the reins on that, did that work for a little bit, moved over to the data side of the house, and then decided to go and work outside of higher ed for a bit, and then came back when this job at Highlands opened back up, because I realized that this is the work that I was built for. This is the work that fills my bucket, however you want to describe that. This is the job that I always got excited about. I get animated when I talk about teaching and learning. It's just a thing that really kind of fills my soul. So that's how I ended up here where I'm at and doing what I'm doing.
Well, thank you for sharing. And let's talk about motivating students. How has your work with faculty shaped the way you think about student learning?
Yeah, so this is where I'll go back to that professor I had during my MA. I don't remember which class it was, but at some point he turned me on to Paulo Freire's work, Pedagogy of the Oppressed, Chapter 2, the banking concept, really kind of started, reshaping the way I thought about teaching and learning. And so that kind of plays into the notion of working with faculty, because what I found about myself was I was always a student and a teacher right at the same time. And that's that kind of binary, student versus teacher that Freire wants to deconstruct there. And, when I was an undergraduate, I was always helping other folks. I was, wanting to talk about what we were doing and really build up the relational aspect of teaching and learning. So when I work with faculty now, I try to remind myself as we go into this that, we're all still students. We're all hopefully still engaging in that learning process. Um, Sometimes we forget that, right? And it's really easy to do when you're juggling all these other demands. But if I can find ways to engage them and engage that inner student and really kind of, get at the things that got them into these fields to begin with, then that actually helps inspire them. Hopefully, it helps inspire their students. But it was really the banking concept, and we cover that when I'm doing faculty academy or other types of faculty development programs, because I think it's just so fundamental to remembering how we learn and thinking about who we are and those roles in the classroom.
When you think about student motivation, and you talked about the professor, he kind of sounds like motivated you. What do you wish more faculty understood?
I hope more faculty remember what it's like to be a student, especially when they're working with me. That moment where we first got inspired and excited about our disciplines is such a transformative moment. When I was outside of higher ed, I used to try to explain a teacher's high to people, sort of like a runner's high. Like when you go into a classroom and you engage with students in a particular way, and you just like I'm actually kind of feeling that right now, just thinking about it. Right, so you have this physiological response, and trying to explain that to folks who've never done it is a little bit of a challenge. But when I talk about this in faculty academy or in faculty development workshops, folks instantly kind of recognize that feeling and go, "Oh yeah!" And so I think that's that inner student in us getting excited again. So one of the activities we do in faculty academy in particular, and this is usually sort of one of the first things that we do together, is I will ask that group to take a few minutes, just a couple of minutes, to write about their favorite professor, right? Think about the person that, really was your favorite out of all the professors you had. And so they'll write for a minute and then we share, and I, go to the board and, I'll write words on the board, and very quickly we'll start to see patterns emerge. And the room kind of gets that electric feeling, right? Because we're all remembering and we're kind of basking in these really good memories of people that were important to us. For me, it's Greg Fraser, David Newton at the University of West Georgia. Shout out to those guys because they're awesome and amazing and inspired a lot of what I do and the way I think about things. So we take a couple of minutes and we bask in that. And there are always commonalities, right? Folks are supportive, they're caring, they're challenging. They push us to do more than we think we can, right? So all these types of words and phrases come up. We take a break, get some water, walk around for a bit, and then we come back and I flip the script and say, okay, now without any names, think about your worst professor or the worst class you ever had. And you can feel the energy in the room shift, and folks write for a minute, and then we start sharing those words. And, it's the things that you might expect, right? Uncaring, unsupportive, hard for the sake of being hard, and uncaring comes up so many times. And so we write that on the board. And then we take a deep breath and I say, okay, think about yourself today. Think about yourself in 5 years. How would you want students to locate you on this board? Where would you want them to place you? On the end toward the great professors, on the end toward the not so great professors, what can you start doing to make that shift, right? And so that kind of helps nudge folks to think about, okay, this does have a lasting impact, because for some of the folks in those sessions, it's been 15 or 20 years since they were undergraduates, and yet those memories are still so crisp for us. And I think that's a really good way to start tapping into that motivation and start thinking about, you have a really, really unique and fantastic opportunity in front of a classroom of students, whether that's, face-to-face, online, whatever the modality is there. But you have a chance to connect and build relationships. And that all starts with the motivation piece for me.
What helps, you talked about building those relationships. What helps students feel ready and willing to engage in a course, and how relationships are obviously, I'm guessing, a part of that, right?
Yeah. And so aside from personality pieces, aside from, folks being able to kind of turn on a performance, I think about a couple of professors I had. They were great performers, but the substance didn't stay with me the way that it did with other folks, and I don't have the relationships with those individuals the way I do with, some of the other professors I had. So for me, that goes back to purpose. And that really, when you start to articulate the purpose of your class beyond you have to take this for the credits to get to the degree, I think that can play a huge role in connecting with students and building those relationships. Um, the purpose aspect keeps coming up for me time and time and time again. When I think about my own experiences and the folks who helped me, purpose was always at the forefront, whether they realized they were doing that or not. There were these subtle cues about, this is going to help you later by X, Y, Z. And so I kind of, started to replicate some of that without really being aware of what I was doing. And then I discovered some pedagogies that were kind of linked in that way. There are really great resources out there on relational pedagogies. I think of Lambert and Felton's book, Relationship Rich Education. There's so much good stuff in there. But tied to all of that is this notion of purpose, right? Articulating to students why we're about to engage in the activities that we're about to engage in. And that is important, not just in a classroom setting. I've coached soccer, everything from little kids, sort of, 3 and 4 year olds in rec all the way up to high school showcase teams where the majority of those players are going on to college to play soccer. And what I found was that even with the little bitties, right, if I can help them or maybe their parents understand why we're doing something and articulate that purpose, even if it's outside of their framework at the moment, right, they kind of get used to hearing that. And then as, we progress year over year through that, they start to expect it. And, in particular, one girls team that I coached for a long time, we didn't do any activity without me articulating to them why we were going to do this and how it was going to help them outside of this activity on this day. And there's always that element where I'm trying to make sure that these things translate outside of soccer as well, right? It's great if we can do the soccer things, but a lot of it's about leadership. A lot of it's about communication. A lot of it is about persistence and perseverance. So articulating those purposes to young people and to adults, this works great in, meetings as well. But articulating that purpose really becomes a driving force for getting to that motivation piece.
Well, that leads us right into transparency in learning and teaching, or TILT. So how would you explain TILT to someone who's new to that?
Yeah. So I'll give a little bit of framework and then I'll jump into that kind of explanation. So TILT, folks joke that I sing the gospel of TILT every chance I get, which is absolutely 100% true. If I'm in a room for more than, 10 minutes, there's a really strong likelihood that TILT's going to come up in some way. It really is just so transformational for me, and it's such a small strategy. And we learned about this at the POD conference in Louisville in November of 2016. There's a group of friends, and at that point, we were all working in faculty development. A couple of them went to a presentation by Miriam Winklemas, who developed this protocol, and came back and they said, we should go back to campus and do this. And we were all University System of Georgia employees, worked at different institutions. So we got together, reached out to Winklemas. She did some training with us and got on a couple of calls with us. And we built our own training protocol and started doing this on our campuses and then other campuses, and kind of, spreading that gospel, if you will. So the way TILT works, really simple. It feels overwhelming at times, but it's super simple. There are 3 components. There's purpose, task, and criteria. So, like I said, purpose is very important for me, and this is part of that puzzle. You start with why you're doing the thing, right? And for me and for that group that I was working with, it's really about connecting not just to the purpose of the assignment, but how is this skill, this ability, this disposition, whatever you're getting out of the assignment, how does that connect not just to the classroom, not just to this assignment or this course, but to the overall curriculum, to the degree program, But then how does it connect outside of college? What's going to happen in 5, 10, 15 years when this idea, this skill is going to show back up for you? And one of the ways that I used to teach that in my writing courses, especially for argumentative writing, was articulating to students, many of whom already had children. That's just the sort of demographic that my institution serves. A lot of them would go on to have children. And I would tell them, think about learning to argue in the context of advocating for your child, right? So there's going to come a time in your life where you have to make a written argument or an oral argument to someone about your child, whether that's a teacher, a principal, a doctor, whomever. You're going to need to do that. So here are the skills that are going to help you do that. We're going to practice them in low stakes ways in this room, and we're going to argue about things that people don't care about. They think they do, but they really don't. And we're gonna test out these strategies. That way, when the real things happen, and you're really going to need to rely on that argument for your kid, or if you're not having kids, you don't want kids, that's great. At some point, you're going to have to argue for yourself. You're going to have to argue in a cover letter. You're going to have to argue for a promotion. So let's talk about the rhetorical strategies that enable that. And that usually gets them cued in a little bit more than let's write an essay. And so there's that element. So purpose is the cornerstone. And then we move to the task, right? So that phrase, write an essay. I can remember being a student and having an instructor give me an assignment that was write an essay. Thankfully, I had a really good high school experience, so I was well prepared for that. But that treats essay, right? Essay as this sort of monolith, right? That there's just this one overwhelming way to do this. And we know that there are, tens of thousands of ways to get to an essay, depending on the rhetorical context and, the moment of writing, right? And the purpose for what we're doing there. So breaking down those tasks are really important, right? Lining those things out. The other thing that happened with me with Tilt in this way was when I looked at my assignments back in 2016, I realized that the majority of my assignment was task oriented, and it was all of this stuff about format and, the actual bulk of the assignment, right? The meat of it was very small and underdeveloped. And I couldn't figure out why my students were struggling with producing what I knew that they were capable of producing. When I started to clarify the task and recontextualize that with the purpose, I started to get better results, right? And Jim Lang has talked recently about the need to unpack things, right? To really break tasks down into their component parts. And that became a thing where I went from write an essay to right, here's what I want you to do in these moments, right? These individual steps to get to this larger thing. And then we'll put it all together later. And putting it together is based on the criteria. So the third component there, criteria, giving students really clear expectations for how to be successful with the project. So this includes giving both examples and exemplars. I can remember being in classes and, we would just be shown sort of a top tier exemplar of something. And I remember feeling, like, okay, I don't belong here. I'm not college material, and thinking I can't do this if I have to match that. Now, fortunately, I had, some great professors along the way that helped with some of those things, visited the tutorial center, worked with other students, all that sort of stuff. But if you're a student who's already coming in a little unsure, that can have an outsized impact. But if you show different levels of examples, right, then students can identify with that. And I do this really fun activity, fun for me, maybe not always fun for other folks, but I give students a batch of essays that I have either taken from other students with their permission or essays that I've created for them. And we then do some grade norming, right? So they get practice applying the criteria and applying the rubric to this writing. Universally, they are always harder on the papers than I am. And then we go back and talk about that, right? We go, okay, so here's where you scored. Here's where I scored. Why is there a gap? And that really lets them think about the rubric in a metacognitive way and why they made the choices in assigning the score that they did. It also allows us to set that standard and say, okay, so you said that this was, a B level essay. I thought it was, closer to an A level essay. So I'm really going to expect more out of you all now because that's the direction that you're collectively leaning. So we have a little bit of fun with that too. So purpose, task, criteria, those three things in Tilt make a huge difference in transforming the way that the classroom operates, especially with those individual assignments.
Why does helping the students understand the purpose matter so much? You talked about applying Tilt to, sports, and you can tilt a discussion, a quiz, exam, a paper, anything. Why is it so important? Why does it matter so much to help students see that purpose? Can we go a little more into that?
Yeah, so I've actually thought about this a lot over the last couple of years, especially when I was away from higher ed for a minute. I was working for a nonprofit and I did bring Tilt into that world as well for some internal training, but also in just interactions with the folks that we served in that nonprofit. And what I started to realize was that, the world is just really fragmented in a lot of ways right now. We're tethered to our devices in so many ways that we just kind of move from moment to moment, and we don't always get time to think about that larger, overarching trajectory, right? The way that we fit into certain things, and I think talking about purpose gives us an opportunity to do some of that, right? We're going to do this task, but it's a meaningful task because of X, Y, and Z, right? So if we were talking a little bit before the podcast about, what I did this weekend, right? Gardening, right? If I don't take the weeds out of the garden, those weeds are going to steal nutrients from the vegetables that I have in that particular plot. So, that task is tedious, but it's important. And it's important for me to understand why I need to do this. Otherwise, I'll just let it go. They're just plants, right? But they're competing for those resources. So maybe not in the same kind of way, but helping students really kind of think about, why we do what we do and the impact that could have later on, right? I think students are looking for that. Here's the other piece that I've been thinking about a lot, is I think in higher ed, we've taken for granted the purpose of what we do. And there are a lot of folks who are a lot smarter than I am who've written about this in a lot of different directions. But for me, when we forget to talk about the purpose of what we're doing with students, we've missed an opportunity to advocate for how this work is going to change their lives. I once had a boss in higher ed. He was our college president several years back, who said, you're not changing a life, you're changing a family tree. And I think if we forget to articulate that to students, even in the context of, my English 1101 class or my creative writing class, right now, I'll use creative writing as an example there, right? A lot of folks think, okay, creative writing is kind of a niche esoteric thing, right? And it's one of those courses that students are going to take and then go work at a coffee shop. Okay, sometimes, but more often than not, that creative writing class is not really about the writing itself. It's about figuring out how to work through conflicts, right? We're writing through conflicts to figure out how to do that work in our own lives. If we produce something that's, pleasurable to read, that's great. That's an added bonus for me. But really, we're trying to understand conflict. We're trying to understand character motivation. And if we do that, we start to understand our own world in a different way. And so we talk explicitly about that at the beginning of the class. Like, I'm going to push you to read these things. We're going to stick to more realistic stories in this particular setting because I want you to work through human conflicts. I have a 0 body count rule. Can't kill anybody because that's an easy way out. Right? We're going to work through the conflicts and really kind of hone in on that. And that lets us start to get into some, applicability after the course. And then they can go and write bestsellers and kill all the people they want in their texts. It's fine. But in that class, we really want the conflicts to be human, resolvable conflicts. And again, for me, that's helping them learn to do something else later on.
So what led you to bring Tilt and Lego Serious Play together? Why did you connect those two?
Yeah, so there was a period in my life where I was walking down the hall and, I'm passing all these classrooms and I'm looking in and listening, and they don't look or sound anything like my classrooms. And I went, okay, somebody's going to figure out that I'm not supposed to be here and they're going to ask me to leave. So in the interim, we're going to have as much fun as we can and do as much as we can until somebody shows up and says, you got to go because you're not doing this the right way. That hasn't happened yet, thankfully. I hope it doesn't, but still, there's a non-zero chance. So the Tilt Lego Serious Play thing, Lego Serious Play came about because I was trying to find ways to engage in active learning, and I want to say that somebody mentioned it at a conference, and it wasn't like a whole session. It was just like, oh, and there's this thing. And so I went back and I started learning about this. And, both my daughter, who's my older child, now a college student, and my younger child, who's now 13, were both, they played with Legos growing up. And so, I thought, well, okay, I've got these Lego pieces. Let me scrape some of these into a bucket and take them to work and just see what happens in a classroom. And I was actually teaching a first year experience course, and looking for ways to engage them in some different activities. So we kind of started playing around with Legos in there, and I started learning about serious play. And then when I came back to higher ed last year in August, again, after having been away for a little bit, I had a slightly different perspective on things, and I was getting ready to go over Tilt with a faculty academy group. And I knew they had some familiarity with it, but I really wanted to kind of tease out what that level of familiarity was. Could they apply this in different ways? And I thought, okay, well, rather than just break down an assignment, we need to cover this bit about motivation, and talk about that a little bit. So I'm going to combine these two things and just see what happens. And so I did it with one group, and then I did it with another group, and I went, okay, that's kind of fun. Let's see if we can do this in a different context. And so I wrote up this proposal for the USG Teaching and Learning Conference, and you all ended up in that session. And, we were kind of working in small groups, but, figuring out how to visualize and articulate what you're trying to build is really sort of the core of that serious play model, right? It's a hands-on thing, and it takes you out of the moment of this is serious work to, well, let's just play around and see what happens, right? How might we visualize this for somebody who doesn't know what this is, and then how are we maybe going to explain that? So honestly, it was fun. That's the whole reason I started down that path, because I love for learning to be fun. I love for it to be unexpected. So yeah, that's really the curvy short answer, to get from point A to B there.
It was fun. It was fun to see how all of our ideas came to fruition, and to play with Legos is just fun anyway. But to see what people came up with in a short amount of time based on the prompt you gave us, and then to hear their explanations of how they got there, it was a really interesting exercise. And so I appreciated that workshop. For those listeners who haven't seen Lego Serious Play used in a teaching setting, can you describe that and what it looks like?
Yeah, so Lego Serious Play. So I should say, full disclosure, I'm not a certified LSP practitioner. I do Lego Serious Play inspired experiences. It is, not the full experience. The Lego Serious Play experiences can be done. Often they take hours and hours and hours, if not days. A couple of days to complete. So we do a condensed version, right? So typically the basic pattern kind of looks like this. So you're given a challenge or a prompt. You're given the Legos, and you build quickly. You have to get everybody engaged. Everybody has to contribute and build. And then once the build is complete, you typically share the story of the build, right? So the build itself is not really the important piece. It's the fun piece that gets us to the metacognitive thinking about, what it is we're trying to explain and how we're trying to articulate those things. And then, you build in time for reflection and dialogue. And sometimes there's a second round of building, for that particular workshop that you all were in. And this is what I did with the faculty academy group. I wanted to tease out why clear instructions were important. So I gave really awful instructions to start with, right? So we went over motivation theory, right? So expectancy value theory, very quickly. And then I said, okay, build a model of that. And the room changed a little bit, right? Folks were like, wait, what how do we do that? Just build a model. That's all I'm asking. And so for a few minutes there, folks had to sit in that struggle. And here lately, there's a lot of talk about productive friction, especially when it comes to working with AI and that sort of thing. This for me was unproductive friction, and I wanted it to be that way to kind of help remind us this is what happens when we give poorly designed assignments, right? Students get caught in this unproductive friction and they get stuck, or they just decide to bail. Thankfully, nobody left at that point of the presentation. Everybody kind of stuck with it. So we muddled through for a minute, and then we took a break. We went over the TILT guidelines, right? Purpose, task, criteria. I gave the purpose. I talked about the task, and then I gave the criteria, right? Here's what success will look like, showed some examples, and then gave you a few more minutes to go back and build again. And it was in that second iteration where we had talked about task and criteria that folks, like, you could see the light bulbs coming on around the room, and folks really got into it, and they dove in quickly and started to build things that were just it's always so much fun for me because people always do the most unexpected things. And some groups take it, very literally. Other groups take it way out, as you saw in that session. They really have to do a lot of work to explain what they've built. But that's really the important piece, right? It's that reflection and dialogue. It's sharing the story of the model. It's not necessarily the model itself, but it gets everybody engaged, keeps everybody kind of on task. And then, as we share those stories, we start to think of other ways to apply whatever it is that we've learned or that we're covering that particular day.
So when we're building that thing we're thinking about, we're not just talking about it. What happens when people build that idea instead of just sitting and going back and forth about it?
Yeah. So for me, and again, this is kind of coming from a background where I've taught creative writing for many, many years now. I've done that both in 4-credit settings. I've done it in community settings. I've done it with, septuagenarians, and I've done it with 5-year-olds. The act of creating, the act of building, right? And I very much see writing as a built thing, right? We're stringing together those words intentionally. So building is an act of translation, right? You've got to get the idea that you have out onto paper or out into the world for other people to be able to understand that idea. And so building with blocks is an act of translation. You're trying to get your ideas into a form that you can explain to other people. And it really forces you to kind of home in on exactly what it is you're trying to get to. And what's fun for me as a facilitator in those types of sessions is to see the ideas changing, right? They'll start down one path, and then you'll see the group start to talk, and then they shift and go a different direction. And that for me is where the real learning is taking place, right? When we're having those moments and we're going, it's not what we thought. It's going to go this way instead. So the other piece of that, and there's been tons written about this, especially in the early childhood education realm. We're built for play. When you look at really healthy communities, there's always an element of play in those communities. Whatever that recreation looks like, but play is super important. I think as adults, we often forget that, and we often, higher education is a very serious business, and it is, but it's also a fun business. It's also fun work, and if we forget the fun piece of that, sometimes we kill the purpose, we kill the motivation, we kill the momentum. We're social animals. We're built to play. And because people learn and express that learning in different ways, this is just one more avenue to open that up to folks. I'll have people in faculty academy sessions. This past year, I had a group tell me, we're not good at this. And it was 2 folks that self-selected to be together who were like, we're not good at this. They built an incredible, amazing model and gave the best explanation of that model of anybody else in the room. The folks that were, self-professed, Lego fans, I came nowhere near this other group, but they committed themselves to do the project. And I said, look, just try it. Just build what you can, and then you'll explain it to us. It's fine. You're not being graded on, what you're building. There are no grades for this. It's just a workshop. And it was just really fun. And they have since come up to me individually over the last few months and said to me, hey, could we do that again? Because I'll be with them again next year for some more faculty development. And so, we're social animals. We like to play.
Absolutely, and it's those fun things that sometimes just stick a little longer in our memory. How could faculty use the same basic idea without using Lego bricks?
Yeah. So the first thing I would say is, use what you have. If you have Lego bricks, use those. If you don't, use something else that you might have. Sandra McGuire talks about students teaching concepts to their stuffed animals or to their dogs or to their siblings. This idea of revisiting and recalling the information, right? So you use whatever's around you. And I remember hearing her talk several years ago, and she mentioned that one student told her that he had a baby Groot, like I guess a Funko type pop, a figurine type thing in his dorm room, and he would come home and teach the concepts that he had covered in that class to baby Groot, right? And so, I always think about baby Groot in that context. Teach to whatever you've got, right? But there are lots of alternatives. You can come up with your own stuff. I love playing around with things if that hasn't become obvious yet. But you can use sticky notes. You can use chart paper. Sometimes my wife laughs at me when I leave the house, especially if I'm going like to a conference, and I've got my travel bag, clothes and toiletries and all that good stuff, and then I've got this other bag that is significantly bigger. That's Legos, markers, chart paper, sticky notes. Sometimes random toys thrown in just in case, because you never know what's going to happen. But I think it's more about thinking of ways to engage students or your colleagues in non-standard ways, right? In ways that we don't expect. In poetry, a lot of the pleasure of poetry comes from this sort of unexpectedness, right? You set up one direction and then you pivot slightly and go a different direction, right? It's also the reason that a lot of really great stand-up jokes work in the same way. They get you moving in one direction and then turn you and get you to think about things in a totally different perspective. I see the Legos, I see the cards, the toys, all that is the same way. I was recently my son and a friend of mine who teaches psychology were together, and we were kind of talking, and we had been playing Stranger Things D&D, and I got to thinking, like, okay, this is a good framework that we could use in a classroom. And so in the months since, I've worked on kind of an RPG style game that faculty could play as students, and there are moments where they have to roll to see what a faculty member's response is, right? So again, use what you have. We had D&D stuff at my house, so I was like, okay, how can I use this to build something that's going to help folks think about being a student in different ways. So that's where we're going. So if the score is low on the roll, then the faculty member responds in an unhelpful way. And if it's, a higher roll, then they respond in a more helpful way, but it gives the faculty member who's playing as a student a chance to go, oh, I never thought about that response being, hurtful or unhelpful, maybe not hurtful, but unhelpful. And so there are cards and that sort of thing. But it's always about, how do we think about this in a different way that allows folks to really kind of engage and explore a new idea and see the outcomes of that idea.
What would you say to a faculty member who likes the idea of play here, but worries it might be not serious enough for college teaching, what would your message be to them?
Yeah, so there's this great line. It's actually the part of the title of the song. So there's a musician I like, Jason Isbell, and he's got a song called "Be Afraid," right? And so part of the chorus is be afraid, be very afraid, but do it anyway, right? So I kind of mentioned walking up and down the hall when I was younger, and the classrooms I was peeking into and listening to didn't look or sound like my classroom. And I really went through a period where I was like, oh, they're going to figure out that I am not supposed to be here, and they're going to tell me to go. And that never happened. And I, made it all the way from part-timer, into a tenure track role, all the way to full professor. So did all the things, tenure, got all that. It was fantastic. But it's about taking a risk, right? It's about within a structured and kind of controlled environment, being willing to test the boundaries of what we think classrooms could or should look like. But again, if you don't have a clear purpose for why you're doing the thing, then it might just be goofing off, right? But I'm a big fan of goofing off too, because I think that can be productive. But if you have a purpose for why you're trying something, do it. I can't think of any colleagues that I had then that, even if they didn't understand what I was doing, they weren't going to call it out in a negative way. They were going to say, tell me about that, right? Even my mentors, like, okay, tell me why you did this. I had an observation one day, and on that particular day, we were covering the objective correlative. And we were reading T.S. Eliot's The Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock, and I was trying to get them to understand this concept of the objective correlative. So I brought in, blank sheets of paper and crayons and colored pencils. And one of my colleagues stopped me and said, "Don't you have an observation today?" And I was like, "Yeah." And you're coloring in class? It's like, I got this. And the students were engaged in ways that, my then provost, she's like, "Okay, how did you do that? Did you tell them I was coming?" I was like, "No, they didn't know that was happening. You didn't know that was happening, but this was always in the works. And here's why," right? The whole point of the objective correlative is that you're giving, a sign, you're giving it this more important weight, and really trying to understand how an image in the form of words can express something. So I had them draw that out, and we, put them up on the walls and left them for a few days. It was a whole bunch of fun. And, was it kind of silly and goofy and playful? Sure. But I guarantee you that those students could tell you about the objective correlative in the context of modern American literature. They knew their stuff.
Comes down to having a purpose.
Yeah, for sure.
Knowing what that purpose is.
Again, be afraid, be very afraid, but do it anyway.
I like that. Well, let's take a quick break, and we'll come back with our continuing the conversation question.
Want a simple way to put this episode to work? Grab our free Continuing the Conversation activity, a short activity that helps you apply the ideas from this episode to your own teaching. Go to augusta.edu/innovation/SOHE, select the Continuing the Conversation button to get it monthly.
As we wrap up, I want to ask you our Continuing the Conversation question, which is, what is one small change faculty members can make this week to help students better understand the purpose in the learning?
Yeah, so keeping it kind of tight and controlled there, I would say pick one assignment, choose one skill, one concept, one disposition that you want as a product out of that assignment, and think about how that could be valuable outside of the course, right? What is the purpose of doing this thing? Where that becomes really useful is to think about, 5 different students that you've had, whether you've been teaching a semester or for 20 years, think about 5 different students. Think about 3 different ways that particular thing in your assignment could be useful to those 5 students. And if you can't do that, tag in a colleague. Ask a colleague to go for coffee, for lunch, and just have a conversation about trying to articulate that purpose to students, and make sure that you've kind of thought through different purposes for that particular assignment. It sounds at once super easy and at once a little overwhelming, but I really think it's worth your time to really dive in and think about the rationale and the purpose behind what we're asking students to do. And if you've got Legos laying around, maybe scoop those into a bucket and take them with you.
Hey, that sounds like a good assignment. So there's the homework right there. Well, perfect. Thanks, Dr. Bishop, for joining us on Speaking of Higher Ed. How can listeners connect with you online?
Yeah, thanks for having me. This has been so much fun. If folks want to connect, the best way is to email me. That email address is jbishop@highlands.edu, or Georgia Highlands College, and search for Jesse Bishop. I'm pretty easy to find.
Wonderful. And we'll have that information on our show page for this episode as well. Thanks for listening to Speaking of Higher Ed. To continue the conversation with us, sign up for our free Continuing the Conversation activity. It's designed to help you reflect on each episode and apply the ideas in your own work. You can find it along with all episodes and show resources at augusta.edu/innovation/SOHE. Speaking of Higher Ed is produced by the Center for Instructional Innovation at Augusta University.